All right, welcome back. Yes, indeed. You heard Retired General speak about the policing component in all of these things. And I do know that citizens time and again keep raising concerns that they do have about the conduct and the performance of the police, which they get to relate with on a regular basis. So that is going to be a key focus, the next one here today, because look, it's something that you can't take it in piecemeal. It's more like a complex whole that they have to approach together.
One of the things, if you remember what Colonel Umar said, retired Colonel Umar said last week about the entire thing is, look, on the one hand are the rules, the orders and all. On the other hand is who is that individual who is the policeman? What are the things that make up his persona? Who is going to, the person that is going to execute this order? What are the things that make him up? It's because at the end of the day, it's his judgment.
Okay, who's the policeman? I know him when I see him on the streets anyway. So, but let's get to Mr. Austin Iwar. He's a retired AIG. He joins us from Kano. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Now, policing, boy, it could be a handful talking about policing alone. But yes, indeed, the IGP launched this Police Order 237. Perhaps let's get you to highlight some of these things. First of all, what was wrong with the previous one? Why this review? Okay, Mr. Iwar, can you hear me? We need to find, give us, want to know, this Police Order 237 that's been reviewed. Give us the background to it. Why was there a need for it in the first place?
Yeah, this has been a long way coming. It's a document that was influenced by a number of issues that were happening around police and the use of firearms and force. And you recall very well that over the years, several international organizations have, first of all, complained about how police use force and firearms, and the number of deaths that were taking place that were caused by police activities, and also including a number of deaths that the police were themselves experiencing, and the abuses that were going on. And having analyzed the entire situation, and also the fact that we already had a Force Order 237, but the problem with the Force Order was that it was not professionally oriented to support police officers in the course of handling situations that require the use of force or firearms, and it was too legalistic, and it didn't make provisions for adequate investigation of our collection of data in the use of firearms and this thing. And more fundamentally, it was important for us to adhere to the constitutional provisions and professionalize how police will use their constitutional powers, and also the United Nations basic principles on the use of firearms and force. We needed to bring out a procedure where this can be very well practicalized.
All right. Mr. Iwar, if I may now, we understand that this reviewed order has been launched in Abuja, and I believe about 2,000 copies were launched then. But then the big question is, when will this be effective on the streets? Yes, it's been launched in Abuja, but when do we begin to see this new order being, practiced by policemen on the streets of Nigeria?
Yeah, the issue here is that, well, I know that Nigerians are very expectant when a policy is made. Immediately they want to start seeing results. Unfortunately, that is not how things play out. There has to be a systematic approach towards training officers as required by this force order. Officers need to be trained. There are provisions in the force order, the new force order, that requires that certain trainings must take place first. And so the first thing the police needs to do now is to start arrangements at all levels in, first of all, creating awareness as to the implications of this new force order, educating officers of their requirements, and secondly, setting up a training system that will that will provide proficiency in the use of firearms to every police officer that need to carry firearms. And one of the challenges that this force order brings up is that a police officer must be certified in the use of a particular type of firearms before he or she is issued with that firearms, which means that he or the police officer has to undergo certain level of proficiency training and also go certain level of medical examination before he or she will be issued with proficiency to use a particular type of firearms. But having said that, we expect that in the next couple of months and maybe years, the police will set up a training center perhaps in every state or every police training school. But of course, you know that also requires funding, which we all know that the police is not getting enough. It requires for it to do the numerous responsibilities it has. So we do not expect that immediately we start seeing changes in the police attitudes towards the use of firearms, but we hope that in the long run, systems will be set in place to accommodate that.
A lot of Nigerians were hoping that this will kick off as soon as this week, but then we do hope this happens in the earliest possible time. But then also one thing I would like to bring up is I've gone through this reviewed order and I didn't quite see an issue which a lot of people have brought up, and that's the issue of concealed weapons. Now, a lot of people believe that seeing police officers carrying, AK-47 rifles might be a bit, too far. So are we looking to perhaps bringing it down to having them carry pistols, for example? I mean, before we go into the major issues, is that something we're looking to?
Well, you see, that has to do with policy issues, government policy issues as to the type of firearms the police officer can carry. But for now, I think that the police will be dealing with what they have, the approved firearms that the government has given them. In the future, maybe it will be required to downgrade weapons by the time we reach a level of proficiency in the use of non-lethal force and other means of de-escalating any situation. But for now, we have to deal with what we have. If AK-47 is one of the firearms that has been approved for police use, then we need to train officers in its handling and use of that particular type of weapon.
Do tell us, what is the difference between the UN set of, their own use of force and that of police's 237?
I don't get you.
What is the difference between the UN use of force and then police use of force, this force order 237?
For now, going by this force order, there's no difference. What we have done is that the UN has given basic standards, basic principles, has laid out basic principles on the use of force and firearms. What we have done in this document is to practicalize, to bring out standard operating procedures that will make the UN basic principles on the use of force and firearms more practicable in Nigeria?
Some of the provisions in a draft of this document, you'd see the proficient use of the word reasonable or reasonably. That leaves a lot to the judgment of the police officer on the field, and he has to take decisions within split seconds. So going also by what the IG said about the trust quotient between the police and the people, how reasonable, how dependable is the reasonable or non-reasonable position of the police when on the field?
Reasonability has to be based on a number of factors, and the document clearly stipulates the test for proportionality and the test for reasonability. It brings out factors that a police officer has to consider before he uses his firearms, and reasonability here is looking at what a prudent police officer will look, including other factors that are also stipulated there. That has to do with, first of all, the distance between the police and the assailant, whether the assailant is armed, whether he's assaultive, the conduct of the assailant, the proficiency of the officer, and several other factors that brings that defines reasonability within the context of the force order.
Calls to question, and I think would like you to elucidate a little further, because if on the field the person the person who was attacked or who was maimed or shot at or whatever by the police feels that the policeman used excessive force, and the policeman says, look, I didn't use excessive force, I was provoked or whatever it is, at that point, is the word of the policeman against the citizen or the word of the citizen against the policeman? Nobody else is there.
Yeah, you see, the point here is that when a policeman is apprehensive of when there is a threat to his life, and the physical threat to his life here means that the assailant is holding a weapon that can cause imminent death to the police officer or any other person that the police officer is trying to defend. The law allows that, and the police officer discovers that there is no other means by which he can prevent himself from the imminent threat to his life or to to somebody that he's trying to defend, then he can use the force that is proportionate to the threat that is getting. If the threat is getting amounts to imminent loss of his life or the life of others, then nothing stops the officer from using firearms, lethal firearms.
Mr. Iwar, something caught my attention in this draft proposal, and it's in section 6, and this is something that has come up a lot, and this is what he says. It says, officers carrying firearms shall not consume or be unfit whilst under the influence of alcohol. And it goes on to say officers receiving course of drug treatment should seek police medical officer advice concerning the possible side effect. So does this provision in the draft, give authority, for example, to a seller to refuse sale of this product to a police officer on duty? That's on one hand. And also, what is the force doing to ensure that, eventually these things are put in place strictly?
Well, you see, the first thing that this document does is to ensure that a police officer is fit, both mentally and physically and professionally to use firearms, which means he has to have a certification, a kind of ID card that clearly stipulates the kind of weapon that he's supposed to carry. And so if in the course of signing for a weapon and the charge room officer there, the CRO or the officer authorizing the use of firearm discovers that the officer, notwithstanding his certification, is not in a proper mental disposition to bear a firearm, has the power to refuse the issuance of that firearm. Of course, there are situations where officers, even with firearms, drift and go to areas where they take alcohol and all that. But then again, the provision there is that every officer is responsible for his or her actions in the use of firearms, and there are procedures for investigating. The document makes available provisions for a systematic investigation of how a firearm was discharged. And recall that the document is clear as to the fact that even pointing a gun at somebody is a use of force, and it is subject to investigation. So whatever the officer does in the course of his handling and use of firearms is subject to investigation. Even the discharge of a bullet is subject to investigation. The pointing of a gun at somebody is a use of force and is subject to investigation and must be reported.
Well, Mr. Iwar, well, watchers will appreciate what the authorities are trying to do, but there's this stark reality. Speaking to some policemen, they tell us that there are some policemen who can't read English. So, what's going to happen to this? Is it going to be translated?
Well, that is for the police to consider, but I haven't come across, in my 33 years of police service, I have not come across a police officer that don't understand simple English. But then, it will be good for the police authorities to consider translating this into several other languages, not only for police use, but for also public understanding of what is required of a police officer in the use of firearms.
Speaking of this language and some of the things expected of policemen, I believe it's in section 3 of that draft, and it says police officers in possession of firearms shall identify themselves as such and shall give a clear warning of their intents to use firearms with sufficient time, for the warnings to be observed. And, there's a quote that talks about what they should say, and it goes on to say, in the name of the president, all persons assembled here are commanded to disperse peaceably. And it ends by saying, God save the president. So is that something we should be expecting from policemen moving forward, this sort of statement?
I'm not really, your question is not very clear, but if I get you very well, you're talking about issuing warning. It depends on the circumstances. If the circumstances require that the police officer will issue a warning, then he goes. Remember that there are times where the police officer has to take split decisions as to what he is supposed to do, whether to use firearms or not. And if enough time is available, then he or she can issue the warning. One of the beauty of this document is that it develops what is called a force continuum. That is a graduation on the use of firearms, a sequential graduation on the use of firearms. It's very systematic, but then it advises officers on the different levels of threat that an officer can meet and the different levels of response that the officer can use.
Bates that just spoke about the oral warning. The part that my colleague also did ask, what informed that clause, God save the president?
Well, that is the constitutional requirement. That is the legal requirement that when a riotous people are gathered together and you need to issue a warning, you have to issue that warning in the name of the president.
Sounds like a colonial,
That is a legal requirement.
Sounds like a colonial relic, because if they say God save the Queen, and then we seem to be replicating the same thing here because it's a democracy and the people, should always take prominence. But the Administration of Criminal Justice Act is still in force, and many have raised concerns saying it requires that before certain arrests are being made, the Miranda rights are supposed to be read to the people. That usually, in many cases, is not done. And so they just wonder about this oral warning and some of the application, whether or not it will be enforced and how that is going to be monitored.
Well, I'm not really getting your question, but I think you mentioned Administration of Criminal Justice Act and you talked about warning. What I know is that when somebody is arrested, he has to be administered a caution, a warning, a caution that he is not obliged to say anything unless he wishes to do so. He is reminded of his right to remain silent, and the police cannot force the person to make any statement against his or her wish.
What circumstances are they supposed to read this oral warning? Is it when they're trying to arrest, say, an armed robber, or is it just for a riotous crowd?
Come again?
In what circumstances are they supposed to issue that oral warning? Is it when dispersing the crowd only? Or do we expect them to do that in general proceedings, arrest of robbery suspects and circumstances such as that?
Well,
Okay,
I didn't get your question. I only heard about circumstances.
Okay, let me move to the next
here?
one because we'll be winding down soon. Yes, you did speak about accidental discharge, but predominantly the kind of cases you see out there usually have to do with extrajudicial killing. How does this order affect it or address it?
Well, I didn't get the last part of the question, but you talked about accidental discharge and accidental discharge usually, most cases, has to do with mishandling of firearms by the police officer, where a police officer is not properly trained in the handling and use of firearms. You expect that he may encounter a situation where he may manipulate something on the firearms that will lead to accidental discharge. And sometimes some of this accidental discharge also the police officer also get themselves injured in the course of mishandling firearms.
How is this going to be?
Accidental discharge essentially is a misuse of firearms.
Yeah,
it results in a misuse of firearms, either intentionally from.
I understand that. Just quickly before we wrap this up, how is this order going to, in terms of its operationalization for officers who haven't been to the range in the last 10 years?
Oh, well, like I said, this is a new dawn for the police, and we expect that officers will be scheduled to go on training. So many officers, of course, for not even 10 years, more than 10 years, have not been to the range. But it is not only about range that the document talks about. It's not just in the proficiency in in the handling of firearms, but all circumstances that has to do with the handling and use of firearms. Like I said, we expect that in due course, the Inspector General of Police will develop a system, a process where officers, especially frontline officers that have the need for use of firearms, will be trained properly in the use of firearms.
All right, then, Mr. Austin Iwar, former AIG, thank you for your time this morning. We'll go to break and we'll come back and take a look at some other items that transpired in the course of the week. Stay with us.